I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session, and today we'll be talking about the topic of holding liminal space. And my guest for this session is someone whose work became known worldwide after one of her blog posts went viral. It was a post about her personal learning experience of holding space, and she's here with us to share her view on what holding space is and what is so important for the way we shape our leadership in our living human systems today. And her name is Heather Plett. Heather is an international speaker, facilitator, and writer from Canada who specializes in the art of holding space. She gathers a circle of people around her together to share stories, ask questions, co-create, and build community. She delights in holding space for people as they discover their courage, challenge their limitations, and grow their ideas. Participants of her Holding Space Coach or Facilitator program have come from 6 continents to join her online and at in-person retreats, where they learn to offer deep listening and compassionate support to others and to themselves. Her writing on the subject of holding space has been referenced in publications such as Harvard Business Review and Grist magazine, and in multiple books. Heather is trained as an art of hosting and the Circle Way facilitator, a narrative coach, and a leadership mentor. She loves to walk labyrinths, make mandalas, and play with art supplies. And her business supports herself, her family, and it also helps build a school in Uganda. And today she's here. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Heather. Thank you so much for being in the summit with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's dive into holding space. And it's a big topic. It's not something that we can cover in like 5 minutes or in an hour, the duration of this session. And we're going to explore many aspects of it today. But I'd like to start off with a description of, or a definition of what holding space is. So could you share with us what it actually means?
Good question. And you'd think by now I would have developed, the Coles Notes version that I could whip off in 10 seconds. But it's a complex offering, I think, that we make to people. And it's really about the way that we show up for each other when when somebody is going through something and they come to us for support, or what we do when we hold space is that we provide them with unconditional love and support, and we work very hard not to impose or project our own agenda, our own stories onto them, and we allow them to emerge in whatever way that they're meant to emerge. And so it's bearing witness, it's being conscientious about how we are present with them. And it's also about how we hold space for ourselves so that we can show up for them. It's about how we pay attention to our own boundaries and our own personal growth so that we are not as inclined to impose our wishes onto them and our own agenda or desired outcome.
Right. So I love how you started out that it's a complex whole of things, and it's not just easily said in one sentence.
No, it's something I'm now teaching in a 6-month program, and I realize I have enough to talk about to fill 6 months of weekly course classes. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see what we can cover today. And where I'd like to begin next to the definition is your blog post that went viral, and it was back in, I believe, March 2015. Could you share with us about that initial post? What was it about, and why did you realize that what was happening for you in your life was about holding space?
Mm-hmm. So that blog post emerged a couple of years after my mom passed away, and it was really a reflection. I think when my mom was dying, my 3 siblings and myself, we all submerged, showed up at my mom's house because we knew she was dying, and we decided to keep her at home instead of put her in a hospital. And so for 4 days, we spent a really intense time with my mom at her bedside as she was dying, and really supporting her in that transition. And as anybody who has been through that kind of grief knows, it's a very intense, very emotional, very chaotic in terms of emotions time for a family to be going through. And what was happening during that time is we had this palliative care nurse that would visit the home periodically, and she didn't come often. It wasn't like she was a constant presence. She just came a few times. And when she came, she had this incredible gift of just giving us what we needed to make us feel supported enough to be able to do this for our mom. So we felt empowered. We felt we could call on her anytime. We could rely on her. She gave us just enough information and didn't dump a whole textbook on dying on us or anything, just what we needed. And I found myself in the 2 years after mom died, really kind of reflecting on what was that? Like, what was that unique quality that she brought into the room with her? And I had been trained in facilitation, circle process, and all of these methodologies for several years by then. And this term holding space had been a common term, but I'd never really grasped or tried to define it. And suddenly, as I'm thinking about what this nurse was doing, it occurred to me that the quality that she was bringing that couldn't be defined and probably wasn't trained to her in nursing school was this quality of holding space. And so the blog post was really me kind of unpacking that. I wrote about what she did, and then I kind of gave the 8 points of how what holding space meant with her as kind of the center of the story, and helping me define that.
Okay, wow. And I'd love to hear about the 8 points too. But first, so you say you went into a reflective mode in terms of what happened and what that quality was that the nurse so generously offered to your family. And what made you reflect on that? Why did you go back and reflect? What was the trigger for you to do that?
That's a good question. I've never really thought of that before, but I think it's just the way that I function. It's the way I process things. Like I am a student of human interaction and human systems, and that's my fascination. So when I witness it, being in that container, I thought I really witnessed something in her that often, I would often be in facilitated spaces, and sometimes people would bring that essence in and sometimes they wouldn't. And so partly it was me trying to figure out, so how do I be intentional about bringing the essence of what that palliative care nurse brought into the room when I'm doing work with clients who they may not be by anybody's deathbed, but they might be in the process of grieving a dying organization, or, they may have similar complexity in their emotional journeys. So what do I bring into the room that mirrors what she brought into the room? So it was, in a sense, it was really about me unpacking that so that I could bring it to my clients and into the work that I do.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that, because sometimes in a time of grief or pain, there's also a gift or learning, and sometimes we don't get to unpack that until later, and even make it into something bigger. At least that's what happened for you, because I'm really curious about what happened once your blog post went viral. How did that affect you, and what were your next steps?
Yeah. Good question. Before I answer that, I'm just going to go back to the earlier question around what happened in the meantime. I did have a blessing showed up in my life just a couple months after my mom died. I was doing some interviews, like you. I was doing some interviews for a course I was teaching online at the time. And I happened to interview my friend Mayanne from Zimbabwe. And she had just been through, she had been on a vision quest of 4 days in the wilderness on a vision quest. And as I was interviewing her, she described this 4 days of what it was like emotionally to go through that, the intensity of the emotions she went through, the deep fear that she experienced, etc. And as she was describing this, I had kind of this aha moment that her 4 day vision quest was really mirroring what my siblings and I had been through with my mom in those 4 days of her dying. So I had this kind of realization that that was my personal vision quest into this learning that I was meant to bring into the world. And so that's, it took some time for that blog post to emerge, but I think it was as a result of being invited to an unusual kind of vision quest to find my original medicine is sometimes the language that Indigenous people use for what you discover when you go on your vision quest. So as a result of that, I wrote the blog post, and I had no concept of viral posts or what it took. People often ask me now, how do I write a viral blog post? I don't have. Just put out the content that feels meaningful to you. And it started, it was a week or two later. It took a bit of time for it to really pick up steam, but all of a sudden it started to be shared by some high-level teachers and even some celebrities. And all of a sudden it's reaching into the millions of readers. And I remember sitting on my bed. I had my laptop in front of me on the bed, watching the emails come in of people subscribing to my newsletter, and they were like, it was dinging, a few times a minute. It was just this bizarre. My inbox was just filling up as I was sitting there watching it, and I just had this overwhelming sense of, this is going to change my life. It's going to, there's something about this that's going to rearrange my work and my whole life. And sure enough, it did. I went through a really intense period of wrestling with, what is this and why is it so important to so many people all over the world. I started getting emails from all over the world, people who were just thanking me for the blog post, and then wanting to share their own story and their own understanding of holding space. And to be honest, it was really overwhelming, and I kind of went through a bit of burnout. I actually shut down my computer for a week because I got completely burnt out trying to respond to people's interest in it and desire to engage with it. It overwhelmed me, and I couldn't hold it all. Speaking of holding space, that's when I had to really reflect on, okay, so what does it mean in all of this to hold space for myself? But in all of that journey, I also started to realize just how important this teaching is, how much it's needed and wanted, and how much I have to be faithful to that as a gift that has shown up in my life, and not run away from it, but to be present for what it wants to be. And so I did quite a few interviews like this one, and I talked about it a lot, and then I started developing some really solid teaching resources around it, and have developed the 6-month online program, and I do a number of retreats and workshops. I'm actually coming to your country in just a couple of weeks and teaching parts of the world. And so it's really grown into something that it has, because at first I just thought of it as a blog post, but then I started to realize it's a much deeper container than that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this part of your story, because what I take from this is that in your interaction with your friend, and when speaking about the quest, how I see it is that you went into deep reflective mode. And usually, and it's something that in different parts of this summit, we also encourage leaders to do, to take the time to reflect on themselves and their roles as shapers of leadership, which is a very important role in their living human system that they function in. And having that reflective time is not easy to find, but it can be so rewarding and so valuable for the world and the context around you once you find it and then bring it out into the world again. So so thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's partially an answer to the question why something goes viral. I think it has to do with tapping your essence and tapping
I think
and bringing
so.
that outward. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something of the divine, the mystery, however you want to define it, that has been in this whole journey. And it was me tapping into and realizing that this is not about me. This is me being a vessel and being a catalyst of this coming into the world. It's not, so I have to be humble and be present for it and offer it up and do my work around it. But if I start to get into ego around it, then I get trapped, and then it's not of value to people. So the other side of what I've really had to learn is how to go really deep into my own work of being present and being open and present, and not easily triggered into that ego place of this is about me and etc.
Yeah, yeah. And this brings me to the bigger importance of holding space. And there's some words in there you refer to the ego, and we see a lot of people who are into the systemic realm talk about from the ego to the eco. But I would like to hear your viewpoint and ask you, why do you think that holding space is so important, especially at this point in time?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the things that I started to unpack what holding space was, and part of me was resistant. I'll be honest. A little bit of resistance showed up when I felt like I was being called to teach this, because I thought, I was starting to see holding space used as a really kind of shallow term. If you start looking out there, and in fact, there's now some parodies out there of people that are, super spiritual and they're holding space, and people make funny videos of it to mock it as one of those kind of new agey terms. And there was part of me that I don't want to get caught up in that, and I don't want to be in that shallow sense of what it is, that it's holding space is just sort of a throwaway term. So I speaking of going into reflection mode, I really kind of dug deep, and I thought, okay, but there is a reason why this blog post went viral, because it has depth and it's not shallow. And so do I show up and claim the depth of the term, or do I walk away from it? And so I decided to take it deeper and to really be intentional about what is the depth of this concept. And where that took me, I started to analyze, well, what is the space that we're holding? And I started to go to the term that came to me was the liminal space. And the liminal space it comes from the anthropological term limen, which is between the threshold. So if I'm stepping over a threshold from an old story into a new story, there's a limen between there. It's this empty space of, it's the chrysalis, or the butterfly chrysalis that's emerging from. And so I started to look at what is that space. And so that brings me back to your question of why do we need this right now, is what I recognize is that we are really in need of those people that know how to hold that container for intense shifts and intense transformation in the world, because we're in kind of a chaotic world. Like everywhere you look, there's stuff going on. Climate change is calling us to a new level of holding space and leadership, and these big global problems that we need to face and we need to be present for in order to shift into a higher version of humanity, and into systems that will evolve for us. Well, what's the leadership quality that's needed in order to get us there? To me, it's really about holding the container and being present for that, that difficult work. And so I talk about holding liminal space as the depth of the possibility of this term.
So, I'm happy that we are transitioning into the context of leaders and organizations and leaderships and leadership teams. And I'm just looking at the turbulence that we see, especially in the corporate context. And I'm just wondering, Do you also work with the corporate context, and what is it that you specifically feel that you can offer when you work with them or speak about holding liminal space? So what is
Mm-hmm.
it that you encounter in that?
Mm-hmm. I don't do a lot of work in corporate circles anymore. I used to do more, but I've now moved a little bit into the train the trainer mode of because I'm doing the coach facilitator program, and so I'm teaching people who are working in corporate. I'm not myself as embedded in a corporate model anymore. However, I have a lot of experience there. I emerged out of a corporate leadership position into my work. And so, yeah, so I didn't have this language 10 years ago when I was doing this leadership. I worked in international, my last full-time paid job before I was self-employed was in international development, and it was hunger related. So it was about how do we address global hunger, which is, an example of one of the really big challenges in the world. And and what I see in a lot of corporate context is a lot of doing, a lot of striving, a lot of trying to fix, trying to it's like if you imagine a water pipe developing leaks and people are running to plug up the holes, but they're not really addressing the source of the problem and rebuilding the water pipe or whatever that is structural that needs to be done. And so what I think holding space brings is how can we pause and how can we in the middle of the chaos, because the chaos has to be addressed, and if people are dying, right now, for example, the migrants who are walking across Mexico, that is the big global story of what will happen to these people. That has to be addressed. These people have to be fed. In the meantime, we have to do important things. But then you also need the leaders who will take a step back and simply be in the presence of this chaos and be in that holding space container of what is emerging, what needs to emerge to really address this for the future instead of putting the band-aids on. And that's what I talk about, but bringing this quality to our leadership is bringing that sense of intentional pause, intentional reflectiveness, and not running away from the intense emotions and not bringing our ego too much into it so that we disrupt the process because of that.
Yeah. And so we are slowly moving into what it actually takes. So what does it take for leaders or anyone to hold space and to do it really well?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important thing that it takes is that you have to first learn to do it for yourself. Because I don't know that people who haven't practiced self-reflection and holding space for themselves can become a good space holder for others or for complex problems. And so one of the things that I've started teaching, I've just developed this material actually recently, is around what does it mean to hold space. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've developed almost right away, I developed some material around holding space for yourself, but the concept I've now brought into it, I started to wrestle with. So, if what I talk about in holding space, I talk about being the bowl. So you are creating a container for other people to work. In fact, I've got some little models that I use for talking about it. So those are some of the qualities around the edges of what it means to hold space: freedom, advocacy, selective non-judgment. I talk about those are all the qualities of what it takes to be the bowl, for other people. And but then I started to wrestle with, so how do I do that for myself so that I can do it for other people? And part of it is seeking out other people who can do it for me. But the other quality that I've developed as a model is that our own bowl is like a cell membrane. So I started to think about, so how do I, what's the container that I'm in, that I'm intentionally in? And something tweaked. It was in a conversation with a friend. I started thinking about we create our own cell membrane to be the bowl for ourselves. So if you look at this structure of a cell membrane, it creates a protective boundary around me, but it also has a selective process of what's allowed in and what's allowed out, so that the cell can be healthy and grow. And a cell also has sensors on it to know when to connect with other cells that are like it. So a muscle cell has a sensor that tells it you're near another muscle cell, so you can connect and you can bond to create strength. So and your brain cells have a different kind of sensor and they connect with each other. So there's all these really beautiful metaphors of what it means to have a cell membrane. And I thought, so us as leaders, as people who hold space, our work for ourselves is to work on having really healthy cell membranes, so that we can collectively and individually create the container for other people. So I really work with people on self-reflection, on how do you heal your own trauma, for example, so that you are not triggered when you're in spaces of intense emotion. How do you, all of these things that are about how do you take care of yourself, self-care, and intentional self-reflection, etc.
Yeah. So, and I love how you said leaders as those who are the ones who hold space.
Mm-hmm.
Because looking at leadership that way is a different way than the traditional one of having to know it all and having everyone answer to you. And also about the membrane. And I find it so fascinating with all living systems, human or natural, that there's a boundary and that is permeable. And what I actually hear you say is that if you want to hold space really well, and you want to start with yourself and making sure that you are healthy yourself so that you can then hold space for others, is that you need to make sure that your membrane is strong enough to hold you, but also permeable enough to allow that connecting with other cells who can then hold you if that's needed, or give you something or exchange something with you, so that the membrane is strong enough.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's really, and that's what I love about adopting this membrane concept into my work is really the opportunity to see it as an organic system that is growing, that is changing. I mean, if you look at a cell membrane, and I don't come from a science background at all, but once I started looking at it, all of a sudden I'm reading science textbooks because I want to know more about the cell membrane. And that, it's a fluid membrane, like it's constantly changing and evolving and growing with the organ. And so if we see that in ourselves as well, we see that we have the capacity to be really flexible, to adapt to the conditions around us, to change for what is needed in the world. And that's a really important leadership quality, is that we adapt, but also that we protect ourselves. And so there's that boundary aspect to the cell membrane too, is that I am still going to be, to a certain degree, need to be always recognizing that if I don't set good boundaries and have healthy relationships where I can shut it down and go away for a time on my own or something, I can't be a healthy cell. Then I become very quickly depleted if I don't have those boundaries.
Yeah. So that means that you need to be at a certain level when it comes to self-development and self-knowledge, to know how healthy you are when it comes to holding space for yourself and others. Mm-hmm. You need to know where you find yourself, and if there are things that that you need to take care of or to strengthen before you can take on bigger and bigger space holding.
Yeah, exactly. And to know when to step away, because there are times when I'm not the right person to hold space in a certain context, where, for example, if it's something that really triggers me because it hits too close to my own personal wounding, then I recognize, this may be a place where you have to draw in a different person to hold the space, and I will step back. So being really honest about your own gaps, and that's where we rely on each other too. It's like, okay, show up, right now you need to use a different muscle cell because this one is depleted and needs to step back. And so that self-reflection is real honesty about that as well.
And what also triggers me, besides being able to hold space for yourself and to be a strong space holder, so to speak, it's also about when I look at leaders, regardless of the context, could be corporate, could be in any other context, is that there's things like hierarchy or privilege that make the relationship with others, or especially the ones they're holding space for, a vertical one. And so could you share more about how can you deal with privilege or rank or hierarchy in a holding space type of setting?
That's a really good question, and it's one of my, I would say, growing edges where I'm being really intentional to be more and more present for what is needed for these places. And I teach a whole module on holding space in that kind of complexity. And part of it is really being intentional about learning about power so that I can recognize power in the room, and I can intuitively sense who has access to power, who doesn't. And some of that is by sensing the energetics in the room, but some of that is also by really learning about systems of power and pay attention to who has the power in our countries, in our communities, in our relationships. And so recognizing that in the room. And one of the things that I talk about is in my work is how can you be intentional about centering the most marginalized voices, for example. And so if and this is something that always brings up a fair bit of dialogue when I teach it, because people feel like, oh, well, if you're centering that person, then that means I don't get to speak. And I say that's not the case. Everyone is welcome to speak. But if you yourself recognize that I probably have a whole lot more opportunity to speak in the general public than this other person, then maybe when we're in this room together, I need to be intentional about giving up the space for that person and stepping back so that that person has a voice. And so even things like when I gather people together, I say we're going to center the needs and the voices of those that won't be noticed in the rest of the world. And that might look like if somebody shows up in a wheelchair, where that person's needs may take priority. We may need to move to another room, for example, because they can't even get into this room. So how do we move to a room, or how do we center their needs to have access to the room, make that the center of our gathering? And so we, find an accessible space, for example. And in doing that, we are holding space by elevating the needs that the world is ignoring. And that's one of the ways that I teach it is recognizing it, being very attentive, and then being attentive to the ways that you yourself have power and privilege. So what is it that I bring into the room that other people might not have? And I'm having to pay attention to this. Even as a teacher, I often might show up self-deprecating or something like that, or assuming I don't have a lot of power. And I'm not really, if I'm doing that, then I'm probably ignoring the fact that everybody in that room assumes I have more power because I'm in the teacher mode. So that automatically gives me a sense of power. So what do I do not to give up that power, but to understand it so that I don't damage people with it, so that I'm holding space in a way that creates as much safety as possible for them, that they don't think, for example, if I'm the teacher, if I'm going to punish them for saying the wrong thing, that's me abusing my power in that room. If I'm intentional about setting guidelines that avoid that kind of abuse, then I'm sharing my power, and I'm being responsible for that power and that privilege. So it's really learning. It's being intentional about learning about it. It's about being intentional about sharing that, and then just having conversations about it. I find often we don't necessarily need to have a dramatic change in the room, but if we can actually speak to that in the room, bring it into the room instead of allowing it to just be a shadow thing, You know, if there's, for example, we're in a room with mixed race or mixed gender or mixed socioeconomic background, nobody ever speaks it in the room, but there's this tension there that exists because some people have a lot more access to power and privilege. What I will often do in that space is, how can we speak it graciously and kindly without shaming anyone for it, but name it so that we can acknowledge it before we have the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that was very rich content. And there's a couple of things that I want to reflect back to you. And this last piece that you just mentioned, what came up for me, it's like holding space when there is privilege or rank or power in the room, or just difference, is it's like cleaning up the space. It's like keeping it clean. So, for example, if something is in the space, instead of hiding it or keeping it out, it's about, okay, acknowledging, okay, this is what we have in the room now. Or there is a difference between people. Also, depending on the matter at hand or what you're trying to accomplish. And there is difference. Sometimes certain people just have more influence or more experience or something that takes more space or requires more space to bring out, to then contribute to what the group or the system is trying to accomplish. And that holding space is not about making that space smaller. It's like owning your rank in that sense, to say, okay, this is what I have. I mean, it's the same like the cells in your body, to go back to that analogy. And it wouldn't make sense for cells in an arm to start fighting the cells in the brain just because they say, okay, it's not fair because you do all the important stuff and we're just in the arm. No, they're all just taking their own space and doing what they need to be doing in the space that they take up in the bigger system.
Exactly.
So it's about the keeping the space clean and acknowledging what's there, and not making your own space smaller or bigger, and being mindful about how you use the space and whether it serves what you're trying to accomplish at that point or not. And if not, then it's usually gets to the abusive side of power or privilege, because it has no function and role at that point.
Yeah, and once we speak it out loud in that space, then it can become a strength instead of a shadow. And so, for example, if we're in a space where some people obviously have more influence because they're in, let's say they're in leadership roles in an organization, and we all know that they have that, but they're kind of in denial around it and they're ignoring it and they're pretending they're just like everybody else, well, then we can't move the markers very far. But if we acknowledge, look, you guys have influence with senior management or with the board of directors here. We want you to use that influence. Like, don't hide from it. Don't deny that you're a brain cell and I'm a muscle cell. Use what you have. And so then power and privilege becomes a tool, not a thing that we trip on when it's in the room. And we start to... You know, we share that power. It's like, okay, so I'm going to use the power to advantage the whole body instead of just to be selfish about it and hoard it for myself.
Yeah. And so I find this context so fascinating because it requires, and these are just things that pop up in my mind right now, it does require that there's a certain level of emotional intelligence and social intelligence and systems intelligence for everyone to know when to hold space for whom, so that they can optimally fulfill their role or use the influence that they have, or the privilege that they have, or the knowledge and competencies or skills that they have to move everything forward and to help everyone move forward. So so yeah, it does require that we have that skill, or at least use that lens in order for them to hold space.
Yeah. Yeah, because and that's how we grow together. That's how we evolve and emerge together and discover what is possible in our midst, because we're speaking this stuff out loud and we're holding space for it and we're allowing it to be in the center without destroying any of us, and we're not tossing it at each other. We're holding space for it, creating that bowl for it, and none of us is getting too attached to it. We're just, we're being somewhat detached, or not, part of the Buddhist concept of non-attachment, so that it can be present in our midst. And that's what I talk about with conflict too. Like when conflict, because inevitably when you're going to do this intense work, there's going to be conflict in the room, and there's going to be some that have power that others don't have, and that's going to raise conflict and backlash, etc. But so even with conflict, you have to be really self-aware. Am I taking this personally, or do I need to see it as part of a system of that right now I'm being seen as somebody who has power and privilege, and so I need to sort of detach myself from that a little bit so that I can look at what is really at the heart of this conflict, instead of thinking, oh, they're thinking I'm a bad person. Well, it may not be that you're a bad person, but you've been privileged by a system that's flawed. And so let's externalize it a little bit so that we can hold it in the container of our conversation and not use it as a destructive force.
Yeah. And so we are in this session, we are exploring what holy space is and how you view it, and we're unpacking it. And I'm just curious. I went through all of your blog posts, and there was one about what holding space is not, and what's the opposite of holding space. Could you share a bit more about that? What's the opposite of holding space?
Yeah, sure. It's funny because that question started to emerge as a result of a conversation like that. So I like to do interviews partly because it sometimes emerges new thinking for me. It triggers something, and I realize, oh, I have to go down that rabbit hole and discover something new. So somebody asked me what's the opposite of holding space, and caught me completely off guard, and I thought, I haven't thought about that. So, but then I've developed since then a whole understanding of it, and so what I say is that if holding space is being the bowl for other people and creating a container, you can see in the inside are the words that of the complexity of what you go through. Then what the opposite is, and I'm now calling it hijacking space. So you're either holding space or hijacking, and if you're hijacking, you're putting a lid on the bowl. So now I'm controlling what's going on in there. I'm not allowing growth to happen. I'm trying to force them into emotional experiences that are mine, not theirs. We hear terms like gaslighting, for example, has become a fairly common term when I'm trying to downplay your emotional experience because it makes me uncomfortable, or because I want to manipulate you, or sometimes it's, it's many, many different things. It can be shaming you for your experience, or making you feel insecure about it, or changing your experience of it, or redirecting you because I don't like the direction you're going and I want to impose my own sense on it. Another term that I've sometimes used, and I go back and forth between these terms, is the idea of emotional colonization. So in a sense, what I'm doing when I don't allow you to have your own experience, I'm colonizing your experience. I'm taking the resources of your experience and exploiting them, or redirecting them, or controlling them, and putting that kind of my own power and control over them.
Wow, those are strong words. Emotional colonization and hijacking the space. That's and it's both very you can almost see it physically, the opposite of the holding space, where the bowl is this, if you were to put your arms around the bowl, and the hijacking is very much the taking or the closing off, and not letting the emotions or the complexity or anything that's in the bowl to be open for expression or exploration, or just simply flowing in the space.
Yeah.
It's just
well, one of the things that as I'm developing these resources, I've really started to study attachment theory. And attachment theory comes out of childhood psychology, where they say that if every person, in order to grow into a relatively successful and confident adult, you need a secure attachment bond in your childhood. And that attachment bond is going to give you confidence and give you, and the two things they talk about in attachment theory is that it's a secure base and a safe haven. And so the secure base allows you to leave it with confidence. So when you're growing up, for example, I have teenagers and early adults who are just in that transition to eventually moving out of the house. They have enough confidence and skills to move out on their own without being too clingy to their mom and, too much. Whereas you can create an anxious system where they need to cling and they never leave your house and, that kind of thing. And depending on what kind of base you create for them. And the two things, so it's the secure base and then the safe haven, so they can come and go as they need to go as they grow and grow. So you need, and so I've connected that to the bowl, is that you need openness for them to leave the space. Like if you create control in the system, then they're going to have the kind of attachment system that won't allow them ever to launch. But you need to allow people to launch and to grow out of you. And so that's why that openness is really important. You may come to me to hold space for you, but you don't want to stay in that space. You don't want to be controlled by that space. You just want that space to be that safe haven for you to leave again.
Yeah. So holding space is the space in the holding space is a temporary one, where people are held gently in a process, which could be an emotional process, a change process, a learning process, or a growth process. And then at some point, they are ready to move to the next context or next level, or to fly out. And
in fact, I would say that if the holding space experience requires that you stay there, then it's not a healthy holding space. So because I even work with people who recently I've had some really good conversations around, when does a tribe become a trap? So if you're in a tribe of people, you like, let's say, for example, you're doing some emotional growth work and you have a support group that you're doing that emotional growth work with. Well, if that group is not prepared to grow with you, then eventually they're going to hold you at the level of growth that they're comfortable with, and not and so in order to feel safe, you're going to have to stay with them and not grow beyond them. So that's why I tell people that at some point you may have to leave the people that care for you, and even though they were supportive at this level of your growth, they may not know how to support you at this level of your growth. So some of that evolving in our life may sometimes mean leaving people and emerging to a higher level of what you need, so that you still have that open container and it doesn't feel like a trap.
Right. So that means then that holding space, by definition, is something that holds a transformational process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where there's the holding in the beginning and the parting when the person or the group is ready to evolve further and is done with the process that was held in the space.
Yeah.
And so it's I'm still with what's holding space, what is it not? And so it's not about management. It's not about holding the status
Yeah.
quo. It's not about something that is static.
Right.
So it's very much along the lines of the living and the evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking of all these complex situations that we find ourselves at this point in time, in all kinds of different groups and teams and communities and societies. And I would like to ask you, what's your dream for holding space? What if we had more people who pick up leadership through holding space? What do you think the world would look like, or what would that bring?
That's a really good question and a big one. I can see so much more self-reflectiveness, being really present, and not so much, because what I see right now, I'm a real student of trauma and the effects of trauma, and what I see in so many places is that we are being led by traumatized people. We are a traumatized people, and we're being led by traumatized people. And you don't have to look very far to see government leaders who are lashing out of a place of fear and anger and unhealthiness and their own unhealthiness, and that's how the country's being led. And so what I really see, if people were really learning the practice of holding space, is that they would recognize how their trauma is damaging themselves and the people they lead and the fear and the people all around them. And so they would work on that kind of deep healing, and we would collectively hold space for the trauma that's in the world and hold space for transformation in that. Because I think, honestly, I think that that's one of the biggest unresolved issues is, and there's a lot of people talking about this and a lot of people really diving into what it means to have this much trauma in the world. But I think that's for me, that feels like a crucial place to start. All of our leaders should be in some kind of trauma therapy groups and holding space for what is it that's, how are they feeding the trauma in the world. And if that were to happen, if that kind of depth of healing were to happen, we would have the capacity to show up for the complexity, because we wouldn't be taking it all personally. We would have the capacity to show up with each other, even across really heated racial disagreements and the anger and fear that exists between in racial conversations. If we really knew how to hold space, then I could sit and listen to the pain, and I could listen to, here in Canada, for example, the big narrative that we have to wrestle with is, how do we hold space for the pain that was caused our Indigenous people? And a lot of people are going to lash back and say, it wasn't me that colonized the Indigenous people. You don't blame me, etc. Well, they're responding out of their own fear and trauma, and I don't want to take the blame. Whereas what we really have to learn is, how do I take a step back and see, wait a second, this is a system that has privileged me as a white person. This is a system that has oppressed the Indigenous people. So how do I hold space for that in myself, knowing that I have emerged out of a settler narrative. I've emerged out of this colonization, trauma and story in my life, and I'm still acting out of that place because it's in my family system. It's in my holding space for that allows us opportunity to be present with each other and to heal it. And I've seen some beautiful. I've done some race relations work here in Canada, and seen some really beautiful things happen in working to heal that. But it's not without pain and without a willingness to be in those really difficult spaces together.
Yeah. So what I actually hear you say, or at least one of the things that I hear you say, is that what holding space could bring, and the big value of it, for many people who hold leadership roles, regardless at what level or in which context, is that if we go back to the original systems for ourselves, whether that's our families or our country history or past generations, when we look at that, when we look at the systems that we are part of, when we started walking around on Earth, it's just because that's when we first learn about how do we relate and how do we function in systems, and what is a healthier way of being in living human systems, and what is a traumatized way of being in it. And from that understanding, from our own understanding, it will then also be easier to then understand others who are different from us. And it's easier to then hold space to the conversation between different groups, or if there's racial differences or political or religious differences, the big chunks that we have in our systems and societies. So yeah, that's what I hear you say, that when we go back to where we came from and the systems that we grew up in, and hold ourselves in that and see ourselves in that, that's also easier to then hold space for others and see them in the systems that they grew up in.
Absolutely. And one of the lessons in my Holding Space for Yourself module of my training is around social conditioning and understanding those systems so that you can, to some degree, see them more objectively, instead of just because a lot of our personal shame is based in a don't blame me kind of, and not recognizing it as a systemic part of who we are. Yeah. And so when I help people to learn to hold space for themselves, it's also looking at, okay, so what made you who you are? What were the systems you grew up in? How were you conditioned to show up in the world? And what of that needs healing so that you can be present and not as trapped in old trauma or generational narratives?
And so as you're sharing this, we haven't worked together. I can almost see how you work together with people and how you do that. And I'm really curious, in these past few years, while developing curriculum and programs and materials for people to learn about holding space from and with you, how did that impact your own leadership in your professional and personal life? How did it affect you, the holding space?
Oh, that's another big question. It's required a lot of me. It's required a lot of self-reflection, and you don't learn anything well unless you kind of go through the fire with it, I think. So, I had to go through the fire and really pay attention to, okay, so can I teach this stuff in integrity, unless I'm living it in my own life? And there are times, where I admit I'm failing at it, and I have to look at that and own it and take responsibility. And for example, I'm a parent, and we all know that holding space for your kids when they've got attitude and etc. can be really challenging, and can trigger us and push our buttons, and so there are moments where I just have to throw up my hands and say, I might be an international teacher on holding space, but in this moment I'm failing at it, and that's okay. Like it's not a competency that we ever master. It's a growing, it's something we grow in ourselves. But it did require me to be really honest with myself. And to be honest, one of the things that happened not long after the blog post went viral is that my marriage ended. And I was fairly connected, to be honest with you. We'd been working for years with marriage therapist trying to resolve what was going on, what the shadow in our marriage. And I finally had to come to the conclusion, be really honest with myself, that I didn't really know how to hold space for him, and he did not know how to hold space for me. We had grown
Yeah.
into different people than early in our marriage. I was not in, and he was threatened by some of my growth, and so sometimes sabotage some of it, and out of his own pain and out of his own trauma, etc. And so I had to really look
Yeah.
at my own family system, like, am I able to hold space in this system and then teach it to the world, and recognize that I couldn't, and
Yeah.
it wasn't happening for me either. There was just no, I would come home from teaching this stuff and realize I had nobody holding space for me at home. So that was one of the really dramatic changes, and really healthy for me, and in the end, a very, very healthy change, because I was able to do more of my own personal growth around that. But and then it changed. I had to be really humble about it, and really honest about where are the places that I need to grow, so that I can offer it and teach it in as much integrity as I can.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Speaking of the liminal and how it always also touches upon integrity and being true to yourself in terms of, okay, if I want to hold space out there, or if I want to teach about holding space out there, then am I in integrity or not? If I then go to my home system again and acknowledging that it wasn't working for you and it wasn't working for the system. So, wow. Thank you for sharing that. And there's so many different directions I would love to take this conversation, but we're almost at our time boundary. So I have one more question for you before we close off. For everyone who's watching and who is listening to us and learning about holding space, I'm sure that many, at least it's happening to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, were reflecting on, oh, what does holding space then mean for me in my life? And if there is one thing, or a few, but if there's one thing that you would want our viewers to take away from this particular session about holding liminal space, then what would that be?
I would say the personal aspect of holding space for yourself first is one of the most crucial things that I would say take away, and be really, intentional about healing, paying attention. And so one of the things, and I just did this, a call last night with my class that I'm teaching online. And we did a listening exercise where I told them, okay, I want you to be really paying attention to your attention and be self-aware of what's drawing you away right now. So when I'm listening to you, for example, I might be drawn away by the fact, maybe you trigger something because you remind me of my mother or something like that. And so bringing that self-awareness to how you hold space, and not so that you get distracted by the paying attention to your own mind, but so I can still stay present, but noticing what things are keeping you from this work, and then taking a step back to heal them and to work on them, and have conversations around them, and find spaces where you can work that through. And it might not be that you need to go away for 6 months or whatever, but it might be that I need to set a new boundary here, for example, or I need to recognize I'm not the right person to hold space for this person because they bring up some old trauma for me or something like that. So that self-reflection, I think, is one of the most crucial things to do on a regular basis, and be present for yourself, and whatever that takes, and have personal practices. I'm a big believer in keeping a journal, for example, and when stuff really needs to be wrestled with, a lot of times I'm wrestling with it on the page. But have body practices, because we have to also release this, what sits when we're holding space for somebody and it's a really intense practice. We need to be able to walk away and release it from our body, because we're taking on some of that vicarious trauma sometimes. So being intentional about caring for your own body as your container and vessel for holding space is really crucial.
Yeah. So what I hear you say is that key elements in the holding space that you would like us to take away from this conversation is the personal part of it, and the detangling of when you're holding space and what's yours and what takes you outward and takes you back to memories of your own family systems and where you had trauma or were triggered, as opposed to being present and being in the moment to do the space holding for others, and that it's a learning process where you can find support for yourself. Someone to hold space for you while you're learning to hold space, and to find those reflective moments.
Well, and if I can give you just one quick little story related to that, an example of this, shortly after I got my divorce, because I tend to be a fairly public person, I write on my blog and I share the stories of things I go through, especially if I personally am going through liminal space, because that's my work. So I teach from that place of personal narrative. I had shared quite openly about going through the process of ending my marriage, and I went through a really intense purge and decluttering of my house, and so I was very intentional about the process itself. And after that, I had several new coaching clients that wanted to come to me for coaching around should they get a divorce or end their relationship. And at first I was taking on those clients, and then after a few of them, I realized this isn't my work. This is not where I should be holding space, because I realized that they may be only coming to me because they want me to give them permission to get a divorce and they haven't managed to give themselves permission yet. Or B, I can very easily slip into a place where I'm projecting my story onto them because I'm still too close to that story myself. And so I started to refer those people to other coaches, because this wasn't a place where I could hold them with non-attachment. I was too much getting involved in their stories. So that self-reflection helped me to recognize when I shouldn't hold space. So that's when I say when being present for what you're going through is really important, because otherwise you're going to do damage to the people you hold space for.
Wow. Holding space and holding liminal space. We've come to the end of our conversation, and we covered so many different aspects. I think we did a really good job at covering many aspects of holding space and holding liminal space. And I'd like to say thank you, Heather, for sharing your knowledge and your experience, and also personal examples and stories that help us understand the importance of holding space and what it is and different aspects and what's crucial if you want to hold space, and how it relates to leadership and how we show up as leaders in the world, and that holding space is a very important component, especially if you want to have healthy living human systems, regardless of which ones we work in. So thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. You've taken us into interesting places.
And as we close off, I'd like to say to everyone who's watching, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you'll go into reflective mode yourself to see how holding space could work for you and the living human systems that you work in. And if you'd like to take the conversation further, please go to our online community space for the Systemic Leadership Summit. Again, thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.